Who was the first monotheist in history? Depends who you ask, I guess. Some would say it's Zoroaster, who believed in the all-knowing and all-powerful deity Ahura Mazda. Others would say Abraham, whose teachings led to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But I would venture that it's this guy, Akhenaten, an Egyptian pharaoh and the 10th ruler of the 18th dynasty. Akhenaten, or Amenhotep IV as he was originally known, don't worry, we'll address the name change shortly, almost single-handedly upended ancient Egypt's polytheistic pantheon and attempted to rewrite society in the process. Amenhotep IV ascended to the throne in 1353 BC. This was slap bang in the middle of ancient Egypt's New Kingdom, which was in many ways their golden era. The empire was at its largest and stretched from what is today South Sudan all the way up to Turkey. Imperial coffers were full and able to finance huge construction projects. And at the time, Egypt was polytheistic, with several hundred deities and around 40 major gods, such as Ra or Re, the sun god, Isis, goddess of motherhood and healing, Osiris, god of agriculture and fertility, Horus, god of kingship and protection, Anubis, the god of funerals and the underworld, and Amun, the god of the sky. When Amenhotep IV came to the throne, Amun was the prominent deity, and his powerful cult of priests was based out of the temple of Karnak in Thebes. Amun was so influential that Amenhotep IV and his three predecessors all bore his name, Amenhotep literally meaning Amun is satisfied. However, things began to shift a little bit with Amenhotep III, Amenhotep IV's father, who elevated the status of a somewhat peripheral god, Aten. Aten was the sun disk, or simply the sun itself, and didn't take a humanoid form like most other Egyptian deities. He also wasn't the only deity associated with the sun. Re was the sun god, and Atum was associated with the evening sun, Khepri being associated with the morning sun. Aten in fact was taken from the sun disk on Re's head. Amenhotep IV continued his father's emphasis on Aten. It was gradual during the first few years of his reign. He built temples to Aten in Thebes, Memphis, and most notably Karnak. This was a bold move. Karnak was inexorably linked with Amun, and it must have caused uproar with the powerful cult of Amun. But this was probably calculated. The cult of Amun had grown substantial power and influence in the years leading up to Amenhotep IV's reign, and may have been seen as a legitimate threat to the new pharaoh's dominance. By contrast, there was no developed cult of Aten at the time, so the elevation of Aten at the expense of Amun seems like a deliberate attempt to break with tradition and form a new legacy. A theme which is echoed in his next move, the sudden name change of Amenhotep IV 5 years in, who then became known as Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. But he doesn't stop there. He takes the monumental decision to move the capital to a completely new location. Up until this point, Thebes in the south was the religious capital and housed the cult of Amun, whereas Memphis in the north was the biggest city. Akhenaten chose a location called Akhenaten at the time. It's now known as Amarna. It's equidistant to Thebes and Memphis. Significantly, Amarna was a site without any affiliation to a deity. Back then, every city and most small settlements had their own patron deity or spirit. Amarna was a blank slate, and yet again a chance for Akhenaten to cement Aten's legacy, and in turn his own. The new city of Amarna saw almost unprecedented levels of construction, and most of it in honour of Aten. Here are some of the construction projects that happened just in a few years. We've got the Great Temple of Aten, the smaller but still large Aten Temple, Palace, King's House, residential areas, workers' accommodation. One thing worth noting is that the Great Aten Temple was in a radically different style to other great temples. Most temples at the time were dark, enclosed buildings with secret inner chambers for the most privileged to worship in. The Aten temple, however, was ruthless, exposing all the altars to direct sunlight and missing the traditional inner sanctuary. It was an open, inclusive space with no off-limits areas. The reasoning was that Aten was the sunlight himself, so worship required unfiltered exposure to the sun. Devotees literally basked in the rays of their god, the peasant just as the high priest. Another stark contrast to other Egyptian temples was the absence of statues and iconography. It was a much more minimalist style of worship. There was no shrine, even to Aten, so the priests had no sanctuary to maintain, and thus you needed less priests. This, yet again, was revolutionary. Not only was it a completely new style of worship, but it completely changed the administration of worship. It limited or even nullified the priesthood and democratized religion, opening it up to the masses. And all these earth-shattering changes happened within the first 5 years of his reign. So to summarize, the elevation of a peripheral god to primary deity, the relegation of the supreme god and the attempted destruction of his priesthood, the moving of the religious and administrative capitals to one new capital city, a completely new style of worship, a name change. To say this guy was a reformer would be an understatement. And still, it doesn't stop there. One very striking thing which is evident from the archaeological record, but probably won't have been as disruptive at the time, was the new style of art which emerged during his reign. Labelled Amarna art after Akhenaten's city, the art was famous for showing elongated faces and more imperfections than previous Egyptian art. Take this statue of Akhenaten compared to that of his father Amenhotep III. You'll notice the long face, pointy chin, but also the body shape. Certainly more feminine with thinner arms, wider hips, and a slight paunch also. It is disputed that Akhenaten's head was placed on the body of a statue of his wife Nefertiti, but that hasn't been proven. The numerous gods of previous years are gone also, in favour of the Aten alone, whose rays are complete with gifting hands. And more candid, informal scenes are portrayed. For example, Akhenaten's daughters relaxing. The fact that his family were given more attention is significant also. Previously, family members were relegated to the background of Egyptian imperial art, or even displayed as miniature people. Akhenaten, however, has art devoted solely to his daughters, and Nefertiti, his wife, features a lot more frequently than previous pharaohs' wives. And overall, you see more examples of day-to-day life and movement, rather than the fixed religious images ancient Egypt is famous for. And this reminds me actually of the Romanticism-Realism schism in Western art, which was groundbreaking in the 1800s. Effectively, you're seeing a version of this with one specific pharaoh, many thousands of years earlier, which I think is remarkable. But this wasn't the only way Akhenaten tried to change art. In 1348 BC, 5 years into his reign, you start seeing archaeological evidence of gods being erased. Names and images being physically chiseled out of the record in temples, tombs, and obelisks. Take Hatshepsut's obelisk, for example. 30 meters tall, 97 feet. A moon inscription and the name were removed and eventually reinstated. You can see from the discoloration around the moon and the writing. Now, Amun was the main victim, but other deities such as Mut, Amun's wife, Khonsu, Osiris, Ptah, and many others all begin to get erased from history. All these deities, along with the plural form gods also, all begin to get removed from 1348 BC onwards. This is really where you start to see the emphasis on monotheism, as reference to all other gods begin disappearing in favour of Aten and the singular form God, suggesting that there is only one God. What began as Akhenaten's crusade against Amun had quickly spiraled into an organised and systematic attempt to remove all other gods, apart from the Aten, from public discourse. There is a debate amongst scholars about whether this was truly monotheism or something a little different, so it's important to consider some definitions. One term thrown around a lot in relation to Akhenaten is henotheism, the worship of a single supreme god that does not deny the existence or possible existence of other deities that may be worshipped. Another is monolatry, a belief in the existence of many gods, but the insistence on the exclusive worship of only a single chosen deity. And then you have monotheism, the belief in one god as the only deity. Obviously, the differences between monolatry and monotheism are minimal, and really you'd only truly know the difference if you were looking into Akhenaten's mind. And without getting too caught up in semantics, it seems that Akhenaten's views started out with henotheistic principles, because as much as he favoured the Aten, other gods were referenced at the beginning of his reign. However, at the end of the first 5 years, you start seeing mention of other gods fall off a cliff, with Aten picking up almost all of the godly archaeological references during the period. This constitutes a more monolatric standpoint. And then towards the end, with the calculated erasure of other gods, you really are seeing, in my belief, the world's first monotheist. So it does depend on what part of the timeline you're looking at, but his actions and trajectory point to a project that, if not monotheistic, was certainly trending towards that. And in the beginning, it seems to have been pretty successful. There's no real evidence of opposition at the time, although this may have been possible to suppress. But it seems surprising given how powerful the Amun priesthood were. But if you take into account the mass appeal of Akhenaten's beliefs, removing the powerful elite priesthood, making religion more inclusive, it does then seem like a populist movement which would have garnered support from the lower classes and would have made it more palatable. However, even taking this into account, Akhenaten's radical reforms didn't last for long. Smenkhare followed and didn't last for more than 2 years. Then there was a debated female pharaoh for a few months, and then Tutankhaten, who you'll probably know as Tutankhamun. And you'll notice he went the opposite route to his father, swapping the Aten suffix in favour of Amun, which explains the subsequent dismantling of Atenism under his reign. The royal court was moved from Amarna back to Memphis, and the Amun priesthood was restored in Karnak, as well as Amun's position as the top god. This movement was solidified during the reign of Tutankhamun's successor Horemheb. On Horemheb's orders, all references to the Aten were removed from history, just as Akhenaten had attempted to erase Amun a couple of decades earlier. And as quickly as it started, this short but eventful anomaly in Egyptian history came to an abrupt close, as the previous gods were restored, and Akhenaten, his one lord Aten, and his new capital Amarna were all consigned to the trash heap of history, almost as quickly as they rose up in the first place. That is until 1887, when the Amarna letters, a cache of 300 cuneiform tablets, were discovered in Amarna by a local woman. Shortly after this, Akhenaten's royal tomb, which had been deliberately concealed, was excavated in 1891, further shedding light on this bizarre but fascinating period in Egyptian history.